My fiancé asked me to choose between him and my mom. Then I found the messages proving it was all a manipulation test. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and I used to believe that if someone loved you enough to plan a future together, they would never make you compete with the people who loved you first. I was wrong. The night my fiancé looked across our dining table and asked, "Claire, if your mom and I were both drowning, and you could only save one, who would it be?" I didn't laugh or roll my eyes. I met his gaze and answered without hesitation, "My mom." He smiled, not because he agreed, but because he thought he'd just learned exactly how to manipulate me. What he didn't realize was that I'd already started noticing the little things weeks earlier. Once you recognize manipulation, it's impossible to stop seeing it. Looking back, that ridiculous question wasn't the moment our relationship fell apart. It was the moment I finally understood what had been happening all along. My father died of cancer when I was 9. One year he was teaching me to ride a bike. The next, I was standing beside my mother at his funeral while strangers promised everything would somehow be okay. It wasn't. Dad left behind medical bills, an aging lakeside house, and a woman who suddenly had to carry the weight of 2 parents. Years later, Mom transferred the lakeside house to me and moved into a smaller home 10 minutes away. Mom never remarried. She worked 2 jobs for years, rarely bought herself new clothes, and whenever money was tight, she'd smile and insist, "I already ate at work." Years later, I realized she almost never had. She gave up whatever she could, so I never had to feel the burden she carried. That's who my mother is. Quiet, dependable, and always there when it matters. Even now, she still texts me every evening. Sometimes it's just, "Don't forget your umbrella," or "I made too much soup again." Those messages never felt like obligations. They felt like home. When I met Ethan Brooks, I honestly believed I'd found someone who understood that kind of love. He was confident without being arrogant, funny without trying too hard, and worked in commercial real estate. He had the kind of easy charm that made people remember him after a single conversation, including my mother. After they first met, Mom smiled and quietly said, "He looks at you the way your father used to look at me." I laughed. "You've known him for 2 hours. Sometimes 2 hours is enough." For a long time, I believed she was right. Life with Ethan felt effortless. We spent weekends wandering farmers markets, took late-night drives with terrible music blasting through the speakers, and argued over whose pasta tasted better while cooking dinner together. He remembered the little things, how I hated olives, how I always drank my coffee too hot, and how thunderstorms helped me sleep. Being with him felt so natural that it seemed we'd skipped the awkward beginning of a relationship and gone straight to the comfortable part where everything simply worked. Ethan proposed shortly after our second anniversary. As we began planning the wedding, his behavior slowly started to change, so gradually that I kept convincing myself I was imagining it. The first sign came one evening while we were waiting for dinner. Mom called to ask if I'd be home Sunday because she'd baked my favorite lemon cake. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but after I hung up, Ethan smiled and asked, "You two talk every day?" "Usually." "Every single day?" I shrugged. "It's always been that way." He nodded as if he were joking. "I guess that'll have to change eventually." I laughed because I thought he was teasing. I would later realize he hadn't been joking. Over the next few weeks, comments like that became routine. If Mom dropped off homemade food, he'd say, "She still thinks you can't feed yourself?" If I stopped by to fix a leaking faucet, he'd ask, "Couldn't she hire someone?" When I helped replace her broken washing machine, he simply said, "You spoil her." None of those remarks sounded openly cruel, which made them easy to dismiss, but taken together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. One Saturday, Mom spent nearly 6 hours making dinner for us. Roast chicken, fresh bread, and mashed potatoes exactly the way I like them. Ethan smiled through the meal, complimented everything, and even asked for seconds. But as soon as we got back into the car, he let out a quiet sigh. "I don't think your mom likes me." I turned to him, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "She kept asking if I was eating enough. It felt like she was checking whether I was taking good care of you." I couldn't help laughing. "Ethan, she asks everyone that." "Maybe." He looked out the window, unconvinced, and for the first time, I wondered if we had just walked away from 2 completely different dinners. A week later, we opened a shared account for wedding expenses. It was Ethan's idea. "Transparency," he said. "We're building a future together." At first, it sounded perfectly reasonable, but after a while, I noticed a pattern. Whenever I transferred money into the account, he thanked me immediately. Whenever it was his turn, there was always a reason to wait. A delayed commission, an unexpected expense, a client who hadn't paid yet. None of the excuses sounded impossible, yet somehow my deposits were always the ones arriving first. Mom noticed I seemed distracted one evening while we were sitting on her porch, drinking tea and watching the sunset. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Just wedding planning." She nodded. "Stress makes people say strange things." "You think so?" "I know so. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Just promise me one thing. If you ever start feeling like you have to earn someone's love, stop and ask yourself why. At the time, I took it as ordinary motherly advice. She had already noticed the warning signs I kept dismissing. The comments about Mom weren't even the strangest part. What unsettled me more was how often Ethan found ways to bring up Natalie, his ex. Never directly, never for long, just little comparisons that slipped naturally into conversation. Natalie never worried this much about family. My ex believed couples should always put each other first. I guess everyone has different priorities. Every comparison ended the same way. But you're different. He always said it like a compliment, but somehow the comparison was the part that stayed with me. About 3 weeks later, we were watching a movie after dinner while rain tapped against the windows. Without taking his eyes off the television, Ethan asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. If your mom and I both needed help at the same time." He muted the TV and finally looked at me. "If we were both drowning, and you could only save one, who would you choose?" For a second, I thought he was joking. Then I realized he was studying my face, waiting for my answer as if it mattered far more than the question itself. I set my glass down. "My mom." His smile faded. "Immediately?" "Yes." "You wouldn't even hesitate?" I held his gaze. "No." He leaned back and let out a short laugh that sounded forced. "Interesting. So you would let me drown?" he asked. "It's a ridiculous question, Ethan. But if you're forcing me to answer, I'm not abandoning my mother." He didn't laugh or tell me it was only a joke. He simply watched me, as though my answer had confirmed something he already suspected. As I watched the rain ripple across the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan hadn't been asking a hypothetical. He'd been testing the limits of what I was willing to give up, and without realizing it, he'd revealed far more about himself than he intended. The conversation should have ended there, dismissed as another ridiculous hypothetical. Instead, it stayed with me, because of the way he'd watched me answer, as though my response mattered more than the question itself. Over the next few days, everything felt different. Whenever Mom called, I noticed Ethan watching me instead of his phone. If I mentioned stopping by her house after work, he'd casually ask, "How long are you staying?" If I said an hour, he'd sigh and reply, "If you spend all evening there, we'll never finish the guest list." Nothing he said sounded controlling. That was what made it so difficult to recognize. Every comment sounded practical, reasonable, even thoughtful. One Thursday, he came home carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and kissed my forehead. "I figured you deserved a break." For a while, I wondered if I'd been overthinking everything. We ate dinner on the patio, laughed the way we used to, and for almost 2 hours, it felt as though nothing had changed. When he slipped an arm around my shoulders afterward and said, "I'm glad we're getting back to normal," I smiled back. But the word normal no longer meant what it used to. That Saturday morning, Ethan left early for brunch with a few coworkers. "I'll probably be back around noon." After he left, I cleaned the kitchen, started a load of laundry, vacuumed the living room, and sorted through a stack of unopened mail. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed his tablet on the kitchen island. The screen lit up with a notification. "Bro, sounds like Claire's finally giving in." Before I could finish reading it, the message disappeared. A few seconds later, another one popped up. "Just don't let Claire's mom ruin everything." My stomach tightened. I wasn't looking for a reason to invade his privacy, but both my name and my mother's were right there. Before I could second-guess myself, I tapped the screen. Ethan had left the tablet unlocked. The group chat was called Future Husbands. There were 5 members: Ethan, 2 coworkers, his college roommate, and a man named Jason. I'd only met a couple of times. Most of the conversation was harmless. Sports, work complaints, wedding jokes. Then I reached messages from 3 weeks earlier. Jason had written, "So, you finally getting Claire to move everything into one place?" Ethan replied almost immediately, "Working on it." Another message followed. "The house is already hers. Marriage makes everything easier." Someone reacted with a laughing emoji. Jason asked, "What about her mom?" Ethan answered with a single sentence, "That's the only obstacle." I stared at the word obstacle. That was how he saw my mother, not as family, but as something standing in his way. The conversation continued. "She still talks to her mom every day. It's honestly unhealthy." Jason replied, "Just wait until after the wedding." Another coworker added, "Distance fixes most family problems." Then Ethan wrote, "Exactly. Once we're married, I'll convince Claire that her mom would be better off somewhere smaller. Maybe a condo, maybe assisted living later." Someone replied, "Problem solved." Several laughing emojis followed. My fingers went cold. Mom wasn't even 60. She volunteered twice a week, spent every morning in her garden, and still walked farther than I did most weekends. Yet they were talking about her future as if she were nothing more than a problem waiting to be moved somewhere else. I kept scrolling until I found another conversation, this time a private chat with Natalie. The latest messages were only 4 days old. Natalie, "So, still trying to make her choose?" Ethan, "She's stubborn." Natalie, "You came up with the question yet?" My stomach tightened. Question? Ethan, "Yeah. Mom versus me. Natalie reacted with the laughing emoji before replying. Classic. That worked on my cousin's fiancé. Once someone chooses you over family, everything else gets easier. Ethan. Claire picked the wrong answer. Natalie. Then ask different versions until she feels guilty. People hate disappointing someone they love. Eventually, she'll start trying to prove herself. Everything suddenly clicked. The question that night hadn't been spontaneous. They had planned it together. I kept reading. Natalie. What about the house? Ethan. Still figuring that out. Claire trusts me. If I tell her adding my name to the deed will make things easier after the wedding, she'll probably agree. Natalie, you're lucky. She sounds easier to manage than I was. Ethan replied almost immediately. She's kind. Kind people usually confuse sacrifice with love. I stared at the screen for a long time. Those words explained everything. The comments about Mom, the shared account, the constant comparisons, the guilt, even the ridiculous loyalty test. None of it had been accidental. Every conversation had been another step toward the same goal, isolating me from the person most likely to question him. I locked the tablet and placed it exactly where I'd found it. There were no slammed doors, no tears, no dramatic confrontation. I simply walked outside and stood in the backyard, trying to accept that the man I'd fallen in love with existed only in my imagination. That afternoon, Mom called. I made vegetable soup, she said brightly. Too much again. Despite everything, I smiled. I'll come by tonight. I'll keep it warm. After a brief pause, she added, You sound tired. Everything okay with you and Ethan? For a second, I almost told her everything. Instead, I swallowed the truth. We're fine. After we hung up, the guilt wasn't about lying. It was knowing she'd spent my entire life protecting me, and now I was trying to protect her without letting her see what was really happening. Ethan came home just after 1, relaxed and smiling as though it had been an ordinary day. He kissed my cheek. You've been busy? Just cleaning. I don't know what I'd do without you. Neither did I. He opened the refrigerator, then glanced back at me. Hey, I've been thinking. Maybe after the wedding, your mom would be happier somewhere a little smaller. The words were almost identical to the message I'd read on his tablet. He had rehearsed this. I forced a smile. Really? Yeah, it'd probably be easier for everyone. By everyone, he meant himself. I'll think about it, I said. His shoulders relaxed immediately. He thought he'd made progress, never realizing I already knew exactly what he was trying to do. That night, he fell asleep within minutes while I lay awake beside him. Part of me wanted him to feel the same powerlessness he'd tried to create in me, but beneath the anger, I was thinking about every warning I'd ignored and every excuse I'd accepted. When Ethan woke around 6:30, he stretched, checked his phone, and smiled. You're up early. I couldn't sleep. I've got that early gym session. I'll bring coffee home afterward. Sounds good. He leaned over, kissed my forehead, and said, I love you. I looked at him for a moment before answering. So do I. It was the last lie either of us would hear inside that house. His SUV disappeared down the driveway just after 7. I waited another 10 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back for anything, then stood in the middle of the silent house. Outside, the lake was perfectly still. I stood there for a moment, then went upstairs and opened the guest room closet. Over the past year, the guest room had gradually turned into Ethan's personal showroom. Designer jackets hung neatly along one wall, shelves displayed expensive sneakers he called investments, and glass cases held luxury watches, cologne, sunglasses, and other designer accessories. Every purchase came with a speech about quality and why it was worth the price. Somehow, spending thousands on himself was never a problem, yet paying $70 to repair Mom's washing machine had turned into a debate. I opened the closet and began packing. There was no anger, no rushing, and no broken furniture. I folded his jackets, wrapped the watches, boxed up the shoes, and stacked everything neatly into storage bins. Anyone walking in would have assumed I was helping someone move. In a way, I was. Halfway through, I stopped at the navy tuxedo he'd bought for our wedding. I remembered standing beside him while he admired himself in the mirror, grinning when the salesman joked, Your bride won't recognize you. I hope she's impressed, Ethan had replied. I quietly zipped the garment bag and placed it into another box. There wasn't going to be a wedding anymore. I carried the boxes down to the dock and arranged them along the edge, leaving several open so the expensive labels were visible from the house. I placed a few empty designer bags and garment covers in the shallow water, knowing Ethan would see them the moment he returned. His watches, documents, and anything genuinely valuable remained sealed inside the moving boxes in the garage. It wasn't as destructive as it looked, but Ethan wouldn't know that at first. I wanted him to feel, even briefly, what it was like to believe something important had been taken from him without his consent. As I picked up the last container, my phone buzzed. It was Mom. Morning, sweetheart. Morning. I baked blueberry muffins. I smiled despite everything. You always make too many. I know, she laughed. I'll bring some over later. I looked out at the lake. That sounds good. Come by around noon. Everything okay? I'll explain when you get here. There was a brief pause before she said, "All right, I'll see you soon." She didn't ask why. She trusted me. Mom trusted me without asking a single question. Ethan never could. A few minutes after 9, I heard Ethan's SUV pull into the driveway. I was already sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee and the morning paper spread open in front of me. The front door opened. "Claire? I'm in the kitchen. I brought—" His voice stopped. A long silence followed, then hurried footsteps crossed the living room toward the sliding glass doors. "What?" Another pause. What is that?" I calmly turned another page of the newspaper. "What?" "My clothes, my watches." Then came the shout. "Claire!" He stormed into the kitchen, pale and breathing hard. "What did you do?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" "My things," he pointed toward the lake. "They're in the water." I glanced outside. "Some of them." He stared at me, waiting for a laugh, an apology, any sign that this was a joke. Instead, I simply met his eyes. "Did you do this?" "Yes." The single word seemed to leave him speechless. "Claire, this isn't funny." "I know. Those things are worth thousands. I know what they cost. My watches, my tuxedo. You should look more carefully." His frustration gave way to disbelief. "Why?" I folded the newspaper, set it aside, and stood. "Do you remember the question you asked me about my mother?" He frowned. "What question?" "The one where you asked who I'd save." His expression shifted. "You wanted me to prove what mattered most." "I don't know what you're talking about." I walked to the sliding door and opened it. Cool morning air drifted inside as the lake shimmered beyond the patio, scattered with the designer possessions he'd spent years collecting. He followed me outside, staring at the water in disbelief. "My God." He started toward the shoreline. "Ethan." He stopped but didn't turn around. "You wanted me to choose." Only then did he slowly look back at me. "I did. And now you know my answer." His eyes moved from me to the lake, then back again as the truth finally settled in. His face went pale. "You've lost your mind." I said nothing. He rushed to the shoreline and grabbed one of the leather bags floating near the bank. Water poured from the seams as he tore it open. It was empty. He looked at the garment covers drifting nearby, then back at me. "Where are my things?" "Packed in the garage." His expression shifted from panic to confusion. "You made me think you'd destroyed everything." "For a few minutes, yes." He looked at me in disbelief. "Your valuables are in the garage," I said, "but this isn't a joke." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he let out a hollow laugh. "You let me believe you'd destroyed tens of thousands of dollars for less than 5 minutes. Why would you do that?" "Because you wanted to know what I was willing to lose for you. I wanted you to feel what it was like when someone else decided what mattered to you." He frowned. "You asked me to imagine losing someone I loved. I wanted you to feel, for a few minutes, what it was like to believe someone else had taken that choice away from you." His expression hardened. "That's not the same thing. You're right. My mother should never have been part of a loyalty test in the first place." He stepped closer. "You seriously did all this over one hypothetical conversation?" I shook my head. "If that's what you think this is about, you still don't understand." "Then explain it." "I'd be happy to." I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots. The moment he saw them, every trace of confidence disappeared. The future husband's group chat. His messages. Every one of them. "You called my mother an obstacle," I said. "You talked about manipulating me into putting your name on my house. You laughed while your friends planned how to separate me from my family." He couldn't answer. Then I opened the conversation with Natalie. The color drained from his face. "You read that?" "I read everything." He instinctively reached for my phone, but I stepped back. "You don't need to. I already remember it. It isn't what it looks like." I couldn't help laughing. "It looks exactly like manipulation." He rubbed his face. "I was just venting." "To your ex?" "It wasn't serious. You planned psychological tests together. We were joking. You discussed getting your name added to my house." "I never would have actually done that." I opened another screenshot and read his own words. "Claire trusts me. If I tell her adding my name to the deed will make things easier after the wedding, she'll probably agree." I lowered the phone. "Tell me, which part was the joke?" For the first time since I'd met him, Ethan had no answer. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry, I messed up. You started making those choices months ago." I got carried away. "No, you thought I'd never find out." He looked away. "I never expected you to see the messages." "That doesn't make them less real." He looked at me desperately. "Natalie knows how to push my buttons." "So now it's her fault?" "No. I just wanted us to become our own family. I wanted boundaries. I wanted us to put each other first." "Those are healthy things," I said calmly, "but none of them require isolating someone from her mother." His shoulders sagged. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." I pointed toward the lake. "You didn't want boundaries. You wanted control." "That's unfair." "Is it? You questioned every phone call with my mom, criticized every dollar I spent on her, compared me to Natalie, and kept testing my loyalty until I felt guilty for loving the woman who raised me." He couldn't deny a single word. I looked him straight in the eye. "When were you planning to ask me to add your name to the deed? Before the wedding or after?" He swallowed. "It wasn't that simple." "It actually was." His frustration finally broke through. "So what, you would have said no?" "I would have." "You don't know that." I do. He shook his head. You loved me. I did. Then eventually you would have understood. That was the moment I realized nothing I could say would ever change him. You keep acting like I misunderstood you, but I didn't. You knew I hated conflict. You knew I loved my mother. You knew I would keep giving you the benefit of the doubt, and you used all of it against me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, almost pleading, he whispered, I love you. I believed he meant it, but whatever he felt for me had never stopped him from trying to control me. You don't love me, I said. You love the version of me that kept saying yes. I can fix this. We'll go to counseling. I'll block Natalie. I'll apologize to your mom. I'll do whatever it takes. I raised my hand, stopping him. It's too late for promises. I looked toward the empty garment covers drifting near the dock. You asked me who I would choose. His face fell. I've made my decision. Looking back, I realized I'd stopped trusting him long before that morning. By then, there was nothing left to save. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. So, what happens now? I met his eyes. We're done. He shook his head immediately. Claire, you don't end a 3-year relationship over one mistake. I looked at him calmly. It wasn't one mistake. It was months of choices. He rubbed the back of his neck. I said I was sorry. You were sorry after you got caught. That's not fair. It is. He started to argue, then stopped. Even he knew there was nothing left to defend. I turned and walked back toward the house. He followed a few steps behind. We're not finished. We are. He reached for my wrist, then released it almost immediately. I don't know how to fix this. You don't. Inside, I picked up a white envelope from the kitchen counter and handed it to him. He opened it, and the color drained from his face. It was a moving company confirmation for 11 that morning. His remaining belongings would be taken to a storage unit I'd rented for 30 days, with Ethan listed as the authorized person for pickup. You planned this? Last night. After you read the messages? Yes. He stared at the paper. So you didn't believe anything I said after that? No. Not one word? No. He slowly sat down at the kitchen table, looking defeated for the first time since I'd known him. I thought you loved me. I did. Hope flickered across his face for a second. But I stopped loving the person you pretended to be. Right at 11 o'clock, a moving truck pulled into the driveway. Neither of us had spoken for nearly 40 minutes. The foreman knocked on the door. Morning, Claire Bennett? Yes. We're here for the move to the storage facility. Everything is packed and labeled. Within minutes, the crew began carrying out Ethan's suitcases, storage bins, furniture, and everything I'd packed in the garage the night before. Ethan stood silently in the living room, watching his life disappear one trip at a time. A television went out first, then his golf clubs, followed by the last of the storage containers. You really planned all of this, he said quietly. I had a long night. You packed everything without waking me? Yes. He let out a tired laugh. I guess there wasn't anything left to talk about. There wasn't. Just after noon, Mom's car turned into the driveway. Mom stepped out carrying the basket of blueberry muffins she'd promised to bring. The moment she saw the moving truck, she stopped. Then she looked at me. I nodded once. She understood. Without asking a single question, she walked over and wrapped me in a hug. She held me until my breathing slowed, reminding me what unconditional love actually felt like. When she stepped back, she turned to Ethan. I'm sorry it ended this way. He lowered his eyes. So am I. Mom looked back at me. You okay? I took a deep breath. I think I finally will be. The movers finished shortly after 1. I signed the paperwork, the truck doors slammed shut, and within minutes, everything Ethan still owned disappeared down the road. He remained beside his SUV with his hands in his pockets, staring toward the lake. You knew one of those watches came from my grandfather, he said quietly. That's why it never left the garage. He looked at me, but I didn't soften. I protected what mattered to you, I said. You were planning to take what mattered from me. He stood there in silence before opening his car door. If I'd never asked that question, it still would have ended, I said before he could finish. He frowned. What? The question wasn't the reason. It just showed me who you really were. He didn't argue. He got into his car and drove away. I watched until his taillights disappeared around the bend. Only then did I realize I wasn't crying. I just felt lighter. The following week was unexpectedly quiet. We recovered part of the wedding deposit, canceled the florist, and slowly began untangling everything we'd planned together. Most of our friends heard Ethan's version first. According to him, I'd destroyed our relationship over an argument. I didn't bother correcting anyone. 3 days later, Jason, the same friend from Ethan's group chat, called. Claire, I owe you an apology. I stayed quiet. Ethan finally told us everything. Well, not everything. We found out about the screenshots afterward. I figured. 3 days later, Jason, the same friend from Ethan's group chat, called. Claire, I owe you an apology. I stayed quiet. I should have shut that conversation down instead of treating it like a joke. Yes, you should have. He exhaled slowly. I didn't know about Natalie or the plan for the house, but that doesn't excuse what I did know. No, it doesn't. I'm sorry. Once people started comparing stories, Ethan's version unraveled quickly. His explanations kept changing depending on who he was talking to, and before long the contradictions became impossible to ignore. About a month later, Jason mentioned that Natalie had blocked Ethan after their messages circulated among his friends. One evening, Mom and I were sitting on the back porch with tea, watching the lake as if nothing had ever happened there. After a while, she smiled. "You know, I never wanted you to choose between us." "I know. Real love doesn't ask you to." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "No, it doesn't." Life wasn't instantly easier after Ethan left. I wasn't grieving the relationship anymore, but I was still learning how to live without the routines we'd built together. Some mornings I'd make 2 cups of coffee before remembering I only needed 1. Sometimes I'd hear a car outside and instinctively glance toward the driveway. Those habits faded more slowly than my feelings. Mom never pushed me to talk about any of it. She simply kept showing up, the way she always had. Every Friday, Mom invited me over for dinner, always claiming she'd made too much food again. We both knew it wasn't true. She kept saying it anyway. One afternoon, while we were planting tomatoes in her garden, she looked over and smiled. "You know what makes me happiest?" "What?" You laugh again. I hadn't even noticed. She was right. I hadn't noticed when I'd stopped counting the days since the breakup. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Work became busier, and I finally accepted projects I'd postponed while planning the wedding. I started running again in the evenings, usually around the neighborhood or along the lake. At first, I avoided the stretch of shoreline where I'd staged the confrontation. Eventually, I realized it was just a lake. It had never caused any of this. It had simply been there when the truth surfaced. About 4 months later, my best friend Rachel convinced me to attend a charity fundraiser. "I'm not trying to set you up," she promised. "I don't want to meet anyone." "You don't have to. I just don't want you hiding at home forever." She had a point. The event was held at a botanical garden with live music, food trucks, and local artists. It was relaxed, ordinary, and exactly what I needed. Rachel disappeared within 15 minutes after spotting someone from college, leaving me holding 2 cups of lemonade. Typical. "Looks like your friend abandoned you." I turned to see a tall man in jeans and a navy button-down shirt smiling at me. "I'm Daniel Carter." "Claire." He nodded toward the extra drink. "Any chance that lemonade needs a new owner?" I laughed and handed it to him. That line worked better than it should have. "I'll take the win." We ended up talking for nearly an hour about books, travel, work, and gardening. What surprised me most wasn't what Daniel said. It was how carefully he listened. When I mentioned helping Mom rebuild her vegetable garden after a storm, he smiled. "My mom still calls me every time she buys furniture." "So you can put it together?" "Exactly." "You ever complain?" He looked genuinely confused. "Why would I? She raised me." The answer was so effortless that it stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Before we left the fundraiser, Daniel and I exchanged numbers. Over the next several weeks, we met for coffee, visited the Saturday farmers market, and spent an afternoon browsing the same bookstore. Near the fiction section, Daniel smiled. "I think we've officially run out of reasons to pretend these aren't dates." "Maybe we have." "Then let me take you to dinner properly." For the first time in a long while, the invitation felt exciting instead of exhausting. We met at a small Italian cafe overlooking the river. Halfway through dinner, Daniel asked, "Were you always this careful?" "No." "What changed?" I looked down at my glass before answering. "I was engaged once." He simply nodded and waited. So I told him the short version, the loyalty test, the messages, and the way the engagement ended. I left out the part with the empty designer bags by the lake. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "That's one of the strangest stories I've ever heard. It gets stranger every time I tell it." "I believe that." After a moment, he said, "You don't sound like someone who enjoyed winning." "I didn't win." "Then what did you get out of it?" I looked down at my glass. I finally stopped talking myself out of what I already knew. Daniel nodded. "That sounds more important than winning." A month later, I brought Daniel to Mom's house for dinner. She answered the door, wearing a flower-covered apron. The moment she saw the small bouquet of daisies in his hand, she laughed. "Those are my favorite." Daniel smiled. "I got lucky." Within minutes, they were debating whether homemade pie tasted better with vanilla ice cream or whipped cream. I listened from across the table, relieved that I didn't have to monitor anyone's mood. After dinner, Daniel and I stepped onto the back porch. The lake shimmered beneath the evening sun. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. "What? Is the lake story actually true?" I laughed. "Rachel told you?" "Only enough to make me wonder what you left out." He looked out over the water. "Did you really throw all his designer stuff in there?" "Only the empty bags and garment covers. His valuables were packed in the garage." He shook his head with a grin. "I still can't decide whether that's brilliant or terrifying. Probably a little of both." We stood there quietly for a while before he asked one last question. "If you could go back, would you change anything?" I thought about everything that had happened. "Yes." "What?" "I would have trusted myself sooner." He smiled. "I like that answer." "Why?" "Because it isn't about him anymore." He was right. Somewhere along the way, I stopped measuring my life by what Ethan had done. What mattered was that I had finally trusted myself enough to leave. As the last light faded over the lake, Daniel reached for my hand, and I let him take it. We stayed that way in the quiet until Mom returned with 3 mugs of hot chocolate. She glanced at our joined hands, then smiled at me. I think your father would have liked him. I think so too. Daniel laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. You should, Mom said. It is. Months passed, and Ethan's name gradually disappeared from conversations. One day I realized I hadn't thought about him in weeks. I still walk beside the lake sometimes. When the sunlight catches the water, I remember what happened there, but I no longer see it as the place my relationship ended. To me, it marks the moment I finally stopped talking myself out of the truth. Real love never asks you to lose yourself to prove it.